Hi, I'm Alison Nguyen, and I did the film History as Hypnosis.
I'm Sofia Chang. I did OT7.
I'm Jen Liu, and I did The Land at the Bottom of the Sea.
Okay, so I'm sure y'all have some questions, but I'm gonna take the opportunity of having the mic to ask some of my own. And I was gonna start with you, Jen. So if we can get the mic back to you. I was gonna start with you. I think that one of the things that's most striking about your film is that for being an experimental film, it's also kind of got this production value and sort of these visual effects and both like practical effects that are maybe like how'd they do that, and also computer effects like the CD-ROM. How did you kind of build that into your language? Like how did you kind of be like, I want to have these kinds of things on a both practical level and from like what made you think to do that?
I don't know. I'm not really sure. I think the most important thing was I think I started just with the story, how all of us start.
Mm-hmm.
So the piece actually took a while to produce. It took over a year. And with that, a lot of collaborators came in, always adding more, not less. Yeah, I don't know. In terms of the production value, it just, as I kept on working, it just sort of ballooned.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of somebody being a stand-in for political and cultural liquidation, but kind of carried in this really practical way, as somebody literally just falling into a body of water, increasingly large bodies of water.
Mm-hmm.
You know, of course, I was like, oh, after this next pool shoot, I'll definitely have what I need. And it wasn't true. And so eventually we did take out, it was an amazing experience, but did take out a boat full of scuba divers and free divers, amazing free diver mermaid swimmers,
Mm-hmm.
and a whole crew, underwater crew. Just because the piece called for it.
Yeah.
But it took some time to kind of get to that point where somehow it seemed like the story needed it. Because I think you can tell from the work, it is a kind of open-ended thing, but there was something about the emotional outlines of it that it really needed to go seriously, actually, to the bottom of the sea, and seriously, actually needed to have blood practical effects and all those things.
And speaking to the story, this is, as you mentioned, this is the continuation, or is it the culmination of a project that you've been working on, beginning with Pink Caesar Slime Shift?
Yes, it is the culmination. At least the filmic culmination. I have still a few more loose ends in terms of, well, we're not going to get into this now.
Okay.
But anyone feel free to talk to me about this afterwards. There's some other more visual art object type of things that need to be done. So that is still waiting for me. But in terms of the film part of Pink Slime Caesar Shift, that's it.
And yeah, so you began Pink Slime Caesar Shift, what, 6 years ago? Some time ago.
8.
8 years ago. How much has it changed over the course of all the different kind of instantiations of it? The video installations, but also like as other art objects?
Sure. It's definitely scaled up. But what I would say actually in terms of evolution of the project is that, in fact, it is a body of work that needed to end. Because, I mean, of course, there's a lot of things kind of flowing through this body of work, but one of the most important things was that it was built in and through ongoing conversations with labor activists in South China. And of course, largely working through NGOs in Hong Kong. And of course, as we know, ever since the protests in 2019, it has become increasingly difficult to eventually impossible to engage in that kind of labor activism and to maintain NGO status, in fact. And so Pink Slime Caesar, Land at the Bottom of the Sea, in fact, was my way of mourning kind of like a death of a period of time and culture in which these NGOs could exist, the death of essentially, it sounds really dramatic to say, but the death of a political movement.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make a piece about that? So that was my attempt to kind of address it in my own way.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be in some ways mostly the evolution. I can again get into the nitty-gritty of genetic engineering anytime outside if somebody wants to buy me a drink. I'm happy to tell you all about the kind of internal mechanics of the greater body of work. But that is the place in which I was delivered such that it created this last chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something about the kind of communion scene of the mermaids eating the other woman that gives it that feeling of like being almost like a mournful culmination of a project, and the fact that it kind of gets fleshy in a way that it hadn't before.
Yeah, it's death.
Yeah. Okay, we'll come back to more questions, but Sofia, I wanted to ask you about OT7. Can you talk about how that project came about? Because that seems to have been something that really sprung from real lived experience, and sort of when did that become a film rather than something you were going through?
Sure, yeah. How did OT7 come about? Well, yeah, it was in 2021 when my friend Hannah and I fell into the BTS rabbit hole. It really just happened to us. And this was after Hannah had already moved across the country. During the lockdown. So we were just like having these calls where we would go into these conversations about like, what does it mean that we are so drawn to this whole like universe? Like, what does it mean to have like all this desire and longing for these idols and like what they represent and what that means about us? And so I thought I should start, I could make something from it. And I had planned to start doing interviews when BTS announced that they were maybe taking a break, maybe breaking up. And so it kind of just became about that moment. It was like crisis times in BTS land. And at the same time, I was processing, I think just like in my late 20s, a lot of friendships that were shifting or ending. That all kind of made it into, I think, the energy of the film.
Yeah, I don't know why, I didn't grow up Catholic, but I was thinking about communion and then also thinking about that BTS kind of Last Supper shot where all the boys are kind of like are splayed across the table mournfully. Mm-hmm. And I suppose like, how do you respond to like your kind of like emotional projection onto like, oh, like my friend change is a lot like the BTS change. It seems like that's something they're also kind of like asking the fans to identify with them in that way. Like, did you feel that as part of the fan culture, that there was kind of a like encouragement for this sort of?
Yeah, I think it meant a lot of different things to different people. And I think there's still a lot of different interpretations of what things like that dinner scene meant. I think what me and my friends talked about was, right, the breakup of this family unit, which had this like mythic quality of their togetherness, and having to learn about like individuation. They're all striking out on their own, and there's hope that they can come back together as like different people. But I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, it feels like. I think that was something that is really interesting to process in that moment.
Yeah, there's that wonderful part where Hannah is talking about how she's like, they're not dying, they're not even going to stop making music, and yet it feels like something is dying.
Yeah.
And it feels like that's sort of like what you were kind of like, you're like, we're still friends, this is still going on, but there's still that kind of mournful yeah, maybe even mourning your 20s there as well.
Yeah, and that relationships are constantly changing and shifting. And we gotta reckon with that. Yeah.
Okay, I've got some questions for you, Alison.
Shoot.
Okay, it was fun to see all of these films in a row together because Jen's film ends with the typing and then your film begins with the text scroll. I was like, oh, this is sweet. But I was wondering if you could talk about the sort of like, there's kind of different generations of technology going on in the film, right? From some of that reminds me of kind of like, you know, text interface to there being way more kind of AI, kind of like, and maybe even AI in our reality. So kind of like, is that part of the history as hypnosis that's happening there? There's also kind of technology going through different eras?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think of the poem at the beginning, which is by my brother, Matthew Nguyen, as kind of like, I mean, I would call it in my own dorky way, the source code as I was editing it. And that is sort of like the counter mythology that informs the speculative fiction of the work. And I presented this in installation form as well. And when I present it in an exhibition, that text is a print, which is usually at the beginning of the installation. So when I created the cinema cut, I was wondering, you know, how do I integrate this in the work? It's very important. And that was the solution that I came up with, you know, integrating it as a sort of source code that's gone off the skids, right? Yeah. Yeah,
the feeling I get when I watch it is at first I like, each time I watch the film, at first I'm like, okay, I think I can read the poem. I think I can go fast enough. And then it completely loses me. And I get the feeling of like, I think I got most of it, but of course there's always going to be a gap. Do you think that that's a logic that permeates throughout the rest of the film?
I mean, I hope, yeah. And I mean, I guess what I'm trying to do with the pacing of the source code is to create, you know, a new way of reading. Like we don't have to necessarily understand everything on a like one-to-one level. You know, we don't have to read everything literally. It can be experienced more affectively or in a visual way.
Yeah.
And then commenting on other forms of technology. I was really looking at architecture actually as media within the work and thinking of AI not so much as, I mean, I think of AI in general as ambient intelligence, not something that is artificial, but thinking of it really as infrastructure. It's in everything. It's informing everything that we do. It's in city landscapes. It's in how we interact with each other. It's completely both reflexive and self-reflexive. So that is something I tried to really bake into the work. And then you also see things like CCTV footage, the AIs in the Renzo Piano building are getting like trained essentially on CCTV footage of a man who they're being trained to recognize, and they see CCTV footage of him all throughout the city.
Yeah. And speaking of the city, like, can you speak about your choice to film or to set the piece in LA? I know it was filmed more broadly, but like, why LA? Because you're based in New York. So why is this an LA story?
I think like, well, the first inspiration was the desert. I wanted it to start from this sort of zero point, and then progress from the desert into the city, you know, playing with the cinematic trope of the country into the metropolis, or, you know, city into the country, reverse. But then, you know, also I was drawn to the history of immigration, in particular in California, and which is where part of my family immigrated to. Also part of the research that I did. The people who I interviewed were based in California primarily. And so I thought that was an interesting through line, right? Also, I mean, LA is just the perfect city for science fiction.
And for amnesia, maybe.
Amnesia, cinema, all these things I love to pick on.
Yeah.
Strange architecture.
Car washes.
And so I said, sure. Why not shoot it here? But at the same time, it was very difficult to shoot it in LA. And so I decided to shoot part of it in New York City, in part just for production practicalities, but also in some ways I love collaging spaces together. It's a sick love of mine, like that kind of simulation that can occur in filmmaking.
Yeah.
And the uncanniness that is sort of baked into the work when you do that. So
yeah, when you like take one outside and you put another inside.
Yeah. So I thought, why not?
Well, also speaking about like shooting around LA, like I think that one of the interesting kind of things in the film is that there's the actual, like the actors are like, there's that scene where they're talking about the auditions. And I suppose I was like wondering if you could speak about preparing, if you're one of the performers, if you could speak to like the performance in the film, like putting together as like an acting project.
Yeah, you mean, I guess on one level I'll comment on the theme of actors, because I feel like that is something that informs at least the latter half of the work. So they encounter these women who are like kind of cosplaying as, like American actresses, in like boyfriend jackets and, pretending to be like beautiful American women in the service of the moving picture industry. And like we learn that one of them has like a very strong Ukrainian accent, and it then makes sense that she takes in these people who are essentially on the fringe, right, or marginalized. And so that was something interesting that I thought that came up in an audition, actually, where the actress apologized for her accent. And I said, oh my God, please don't apologize for your accent. I would never make you change your accent. I would just cast somebody else. That's not what I wanted. That's not my kind of MO as a director, to like beat that out of you. But then I thought, that's really interesting, and why not work that into the story? So I guess my process does shift, and I interact with the actors, and I will rewrite scenes, as I cast. Yeah.
I was just making connections as you were talking that like the doppelgangers in that moment, it feels like they're kind of learning their lines. They're like, oh, we should smoke, and like they're figuring out how to do that. So that reminds me of the actors, and then of course the karaoke is another scene where you're being like fed your lines by a screen.
Yeah.
And so cool. I'm just making those connections right now.
It's all alive, baby. Yeah. No, but I think like the process, it was pretty essential that I was in this group of actors performing, because we were shooting in a very hybrid style. Kind of documentary style, kind of fiction. And with that comes a lot of like direction that needs to happen from within the group, right? So we were filming in public places that we didn't have like a permit for. So there needed to be a lot of coordination based on like what I'm doing and what the camera's doing, what the amazing producers who are here, Mustafa.
Oh, round of applause for the producers. Thanks for coming down.
Ryan Contreras, they're right there. What they were doing. So it was both practical and also conceptual.
Meaning like practical in terms of like having as few people as possible if you're going to be shooting, like.
Yeah, and also like practical in terms of my own involvement.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that particular way.
Yeah.
I mean, performance is something I really love and is newer to my practice, but I do want to stress there was a practical aspect to it, Yeah. I feel like filmmakers like don't talk about that.
Right. That like that it just needed to be that way in some ways, but also like. Yeah. I mean, I think it works. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
You want me to just talk?
I think so.
Okay, cool. Hi.
Hi, Noah.
Thank you all for sharing amazing work. It seems like this kind of theme of death across the films, which I think is something, at least for me, where I'm at, is like really kind of celebrating death and not being afraid of it, and embracing it. And I really, I wanted to ask Alison a question, because I really enjoyed your film. Like, everything about it was, speaking to me. And there's so many layers to it. I just really enjoyed all of it. And, you know, I got a lot of things out of it, especially the programming, like the mind kind of being blank and how it's programmed. And I appreciate the writing a lot, like the writing of so many lines that resonated for me. And I really liked how, you know, the characters were really blank in their mind, that they couldn't really register questions or phrases that in our program minds would be taken as offensive. You know, like when the lady was like, "Where are you from?" And they just said, like, "I don't remember." You know, and when they were talking to the actors, she was like, "You're white? Like, what does that even mean?" You know, so I'm taking this as like a way for us to think about what it is, like how we think about things, and just kind of like throwing the whole programming away. Like at the end of the thing, they throw it in the washing machine, and it's kind of like goes back to the opening scene where they're in the car wash, and I saw the parallel between the washing machine and the car wash. So just like, there's more things that I could say that I got out of it, but I just wanted to hear more about like your inspiration, or like what inspired you, because you know, I also appreciate the architecture, since you know, I grew up in parts of LA, so that also speaks to me. But as far as like the mind programming and the memory aspect, I just want to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great Q&A question. Usually we get these dots that are like, but being like, I see death in all these films is so great. And thank you for your reading of the film. It's like, you know, so it's really touching on so many things I was thinking about in the process. But I think, you know, there were, how do I answer this succinctly without rambling? One of the, and I think this ties into death. So the film is dedicated to a family member of mine, Unui, who came to the US from Vietnam after 1975, after the fall of the country, with her teeth dyed black, which was a kind of cosmetic ritual. And she died during the pandemic. She kept her teeth black till the day they fell out. I'm serious. And then she got dentures, and so she gave up that practice. But I remember being terrified of her as a kid. Just I thought she was a witch. She kind of refused to speak English, actually. So we communicated more in like, I guess, like laughter, or sort of like non-verbal communication. And I mean, looking back on it, she was very stubborn and kind of just really resilient. And after she died, I wanted to do something where I dedicated a work to her, but you know, there's so many like corny and like dreadful and boring ways to go about that. And I thought the black teeth was a really interesting symbol. It also alludes to like subcultural performance icons, Kemba Fowler, etc., who I'm also close to. And so I thought that was like an interesting symbol, because on the one hand it is ethnographic and personal. On the other hand, it is just oniric and kind of does allude to death in some ways. And then it's also just very off-putting, like perceptually, like you look in the mirror and you think your teeth are missing. At least this was some things that happened in the preparation. So I was like just trusting in those symbols, you know, to communicate a lot, and people could take them however they wanted, you know? Like if they did not link it to my, you know, grandmother's best friend, that was fine. But like, you know, if you did know the cultural association, cool. But I think like this idea of memory and the resurgence of a memory that has been attempted to been erased, you know, by assimilatory forces, you know, is a theme. And like, can you actually erase a memory, you know, by processes of assimilation or processes of being integrated into an institution or I think capitalism? I don't know, but I would say in this film, you can't. And the persistence, I mean, I hope that we continue to remember, right? And I think that's what we see, hopefully, in this film.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Yes.
Hi. Thank you all so much for your films. Again, they're really wonderful. This is a question to anyone who wants to answer, but I was wondering about like spontaneity and like, do you have everything planned out at the beginning, like with your idea, and you just like go out and you shoot, or like how much of it is like along the way you find a new idea or like a new scene that you want to film, and then it sort of changes into something different. So yeah. Just talked a lot. So.
I can say a little bit, but I feel like I'd love to hear what you have to say. Yeah, I work primarily as an editor for nonfiction, and so I feel like a lot of my process is in, just getting immersed in footage and making these loose connections, and then putting things together and realizing it's like, synthesis, creating something more than it was before. And for my film, it really felt like everything came together in that moment really quickly. Like, I think I edited it in like a week or two, and then I didn't get any feedback, and then it was done. And so, for me, it felt like there was like a definite ending point where it felt complete. Yeah.
We have to talk about that academic book that just came out about all those academic ladies who wrote those essays about BTS. Right. Actually, this is something that I wanted, it in some ways links to the discussion about black teeth, weirdly. I can bridge a little bit. It was really interesting seeing that. And you know what I was thinking about a lot? I'm sure it's on your docket, but I also want to make sure it's said is In Praise of Shadows. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. But this, it was written at the turn of the 19th into 20th century, I think. Feel free to fact check me. But it was talking about traditional Japanese aesthetics and this idea that in the world of shadow, in the world without electric light, that the black lacquered teeth are beautiful and they disappear. But that they could never hold up to the electric light of the West. And there was just something about that that really struck me in that kind of like bright artificial light, how the teeth didn't hold up, right? And there's something vaguely about death to me about that as well. And all that is to say, I don't know, in terms of, what was the question again? It was like
Changes during the
spontaneity,
spontaneity.
Right, yes. Things do happen, particularly for me when I suspect it's similar for all three of us in different ways, but it's such a gift to have performers just kind of like making themselves available for this kind of strange art production. So usually I do find that I do various improv moments, but actually it was interesting to have that underwater shoot because in fact we couldn't improv. Because there's only so much breath that each of those mermaids can hold. And in fact, we were so deep down, it was 40 meters down in the ocean. So they each had to be delivered by scuba divers. So they had to know exactly what they were doing. Also, they couldn't see. So it's like all those things piled up together. It's like, obviously, we're not going to improv. We did a lot of rehearsal. That was really a moment where there was like no improv, but still had a really great exchange with my cinematographer, and we still did make changes. But I find that actually what I end up doing is making a lot of improvisatory choices in the edit, actually. Of course, my work lends itself to that. A lot of the making of the work happens in the editing. And in some ways, like, again, it's that kind of, back to that idea of like the black teeth and the kind of light of electric day. It's like all these texts kind of come together and all these beautiful scenes come together. And then it becomes a question of like trying to find just the right kind of beauty, but also discomfiture and misfit, but in a good way, if that makes sense. But that really happens in the editing, for me at least.
Wow, that was so this has been a really great conversation, but we have to clear the theater for the next screenings that are coming on. Jen's already offered that you could buy her a drink to get more answers. I'm sure the other filmmakers feel the same. Thank you guys for staying for the Q&A, and thank you guys so much for caring for our work.